The sound of sobbing pierced through the thin boarding house walls in Silver Creek, Montana territory, waking Eliza Hartford for the third consecutive night as she pressed her tear-stained face into her pillow, trying desperately to muffle the grief that racked her body with such violence she thought her ribs might crack from the force of it. The year was 1878, and Eliza had arrived in this dusty frontier town only 2 weeks prior, fleeing the ruins of her life back in St. Louis after her husband of 3 years had been killed in a factory accident, leaving her with nothing but debts she could not pay and memories that haunted her every waking moment. She was 22 years old and felt as though her life had ended the moment they had lowered William's coffin into the cold ground. But with no family to turn to and creditors threatening to take everything she owned, Eliza had sold her few possessions, purchased a train ticket west, and found herself in this rough Montana mining town where she knew not a single soul. The boarding house where she rented a cramped room sat on the edge of Silver Creek's main street, a weathered 2-story structure that creaked and groaned with every gust of wind that swept down from the mountains. The walls were paper thin, and Eliza could hear everything from the snoring of the miner in the next room to the arguments of the married couple downstairs. And they, in turn, could hear her crying every single night since her arrival. "For the love of God, woman, some of us need to work in the morning," a gruff voice had shouted through the wall the previous night, followed by the angry thumping of a fist against the wooden partition. Eliza had tried to stop, truly she had, but the grief was like a living thing inside her chest, clawing its way out no matter how hard she fought to contain it. During the daylight hours, she could maintain a composed facade as she walked through town searching for work, her black mourning dress marking her as a widow despite her youth. But when darkness fell and she was alone in that small room with nothing but her thoughts and the crushing weight of her loss, the tears would come unbidden, racking her slender frame until she was exhausted and hollow. Tonight was no different. Eliza buried her face in her pillow, her shoulders shaking as she wept for William, for the children they would never have, for the life that had been stolen from them both. She wept for her loneliness, for her fear of the future, for the overwhelming sense that she was utterly and completely alone in this harsh and unforgiving world. "Damn it all to hell," came another voice through the wall, followed by more pounding. "This is the last straw. I'm going to speak to Mrs. Henderson about this in the morning. That woman needs to go." Eliza pressed her hand over her mouth, trying to stifle the sobs, but it was no use. The grief was too powerful, too all-consuming to be contained. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes burned, until the darkness outside her window began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The next morning, Eliza descended the narrow staircase with her eyes downcast, knowing that the other boarders would be staring at her with resentment and irritation. Sure enough, as she entered the dining room where Mrs. Henderson served a simple breakfast of porridge and coffee, the conversation died abruptly. 3 miners sat at the long wooden table, along with an elderly woman who ran the general store and a young clerk from the assayer's office. All of them turned to look at Eliza as she entered, their expressions ranging from annoyance to outright hostility. "Mrs. Hartford," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice cool and disapproving, "might I have a word with you after breakfast?" Eliza nodded mutely, her cheeks burning with shame as she took a seat at the far end of the table. She could not bring herself to meet anyone's eyes as she forced down a few spoonfuls of the bland porridge, her stomach churning with anxiety. She knew what was coming. Mrs. Henderson was going to ask her to leave. Fun, and Eliza had nowhere else to go. Sure enough, after the other boarders had departed for their various employments, Mrs. Henderson approached Eliza with her arms crossed over her ample bosom and her mouth set in a thin, disapproving line. "Mrs. Hartford, I understand that you are in mourning," the older woman began, her tone suggesting that she did not, in fact, understand at all. "But your nightly disturbances are disturbing the other guests. I've had 3 complaints this morning alone, and I simply cannot have it. This is a respectable establishment, and I must ask you to find other accommodations." Eliza's heart sank like a stone in her chest. "Please, Mrs. Henderson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I have nowhere else to go. I will try harder to be quiet. I promise you would not even know I was there." "Mrs." Von Henderson's expression softened slightly, but she remained firm. "I am sorry, Mrs. Hartford, truly I am. but I have a business to run, and I cannot afford to lose paying customers. You have until the end of the week to find somewhere else to stay." 3 days. Eliza had 3 days to find new lodging in a town where she knew no one and had no prospects. She nodded numbly and retreated to her room, where she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and stared at the bare walls, feeling as though she were drowning in despair. That afternoon, Eliza walked through the dusty streets of Silver Creek, desperately inquiring at every establishment whether they knew of any rooms to let or any employment that might be available. The town was rough and rowdy, filled with miners and prospectors who had come seeking their fortunes in the gold-rich mountains. The main street was lined with saloons, gambling halls, and supply stores, all doing a brisk business catering to the needs of men who spent their days underground and their nights trying to forget the backbreaking labor and constant danger. Eliza received the same response everywhere she went. No one was hiring, and there were no rooms available. The few respectable women in town looked at her with pity, but offered no assistance. By the time the sun began to set behind the jagged peaks that surrounded the valley, Eliza was exhausted and despairing, her feet aching from walking and her heart heavy with the certainty that she was going to end up on the street with nowhere to turn. Thus, she was making her way back toward the boarding house when she heard raised voices coming from the alley beside the general store. Curiosity and a vague sense of concern made her pause and peer around the corner, where she saw 3 rough-looking men surrounding a younger boy who could not have been more than 15. They were laughing and jeering as they shoved him back and forth between them, and Eliza could see that the boy's face was already bruised and bloodied. "Think you can just walk around our town without paying a toll, boy?" one of the men growled, punctuating his words with another shove. Eliza knew she should walk away. She was a woman alone in a frontier town, and interfering in such matters could only bring her trouble. But something in the boy's terrified expression reminded her of her younger brother back in St. Louis, and before she could think better of it, she was stepping into the alley and calling out in a voice that shook only slightly, "Leave him alone." The 3 men turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from surprise to amusement. The largest of them, a bull-necked brute with a scar running down one cheek, took a step toward her with a leer that made Eliza's skin crawl. "Well, well, what have we here?" he said, his voice thick with menace. "You the boy's mother, come to save him?" "I am no relation to him," Eliza said, forcing herself to stand her ground, even though every instinct was screaming at her to run. "But I will not stand by and watch you beat a child." The man laughed, a harsh and ugly sound. "Hear that, boys? The lady will not stand by. Maybe we should teach her some manners about minding her own business." He reached out to grab Eliza's arm, and she stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. She opened her mouth to scream, but before she could make a sound, a massive figure appeared at the mouth of the alley, blocking out the fading sunlight like a mountain come to life. "The lady asked you to leave the boy alone," a deep voice rumbled, calm and steady, but carrying an undercurrent of barely controlled violence that made the hair on the back of Eliza's neck stand up. "I suggest you listen." The 3 men spun around, and Eliza got her first look at the man who had spoken. He was enormous, easily standing 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the narrow alley. His arms were thick with corded muscle that strained against the worn fabric of his shirt, and his chest was like a barrel beneath the leather vest he wore. Long, dark hair fell past his shoulders, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but his eyes were what caught Eliza's attention. They were a startling pale blue, like chips of ice, and they were fixed on the 3 men with an intensity that was almost physical. "This ain't your concern, Bennett," the scarred man said, but there was considerably less bravado in his voice now. "I am making it my concern, Tucker," the giant replied, taking a step into the alley. His movements were surprisingly fluid for a man of his size, like a mountain lion stalking its prey. "Now you and your friends are going to walk away, and you are not going to bother this boy or this woman again. Are we clear?" Tucker looked as though he wanted to argue, but after a long moment of tension-filled silence, he spat on the ground and gestured to his companions. "Come on, boys, this ain't worth the trouble." The 3 men slouched away, casting dark looks over their shoulders as they went. The boy wasted no time in scrambling to his feet and disappearing down the alley in the opposite direction, not even pausing to offer thanks. That left Eliza alone with the mountain of a man who had just saved her from God only knew what fate. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice sounding thin and shaky to her own ears. "I should not have interfered, but I could not just stand by and watch them hurt that boy." The man turned those pale blue eyes on her, and Eliza felt as though he could see straight through to her soul. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 30 or 32, with strong, handsome features beneath the beard. His face was weathered and tanned from long exposure to the elements, and there was a wariness in his expression that spoke of a man who had learned not to trust easily. "That was a foolish thing to do," he said, his voice gentler than she expected. "Tucker and his friends are bad men. They would not have hesitated to hurt you." "I know," Eliza admitted, feeling suddenly foolish and reckless. "But I could not help myself. The boy reminded me of my brother." The man studied her for a long moment, and Eliza found herself unable to look away from those penetrating eyes. Finally, he gave a slight nod and said, "You are new in town. The widow staying at Mrs. Henderson's place." It was not a question, and Eliza realized that in a town as small as Silver Creek, everyone knew everyone else's business. "Yes, I'm Eliza Hartford. I arrived 2 weeks ago from St. Louis." "Colton Bennett," the man said, extending a hand that looked like it could crush boulders. Eliza placed her much smaller hand in his, feeling the calluses and the raw strength in his grip, though he was careful to be gentle with her. "I have a cabin up in the mountains about 5 miles from town. I come down every couple of weeks for supplies." "It is a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Bennett," Eliza said, withdrawing her hand and feeling a strange tingling sensation where his skin had touched hers. "And thank you again for your assistance. I should be getting back to the boarding house before dark." She started to walk past him, but his voice stopped her. "I heard you're looking for work." Eliza turned back, hope flickering in her chest despite her efforts to quash it. "Yes, I am. Do you know of something?" Colton was silent for a moment, seeming to wrestle with some internal debate. Finally, he said, "I could use some help. The cabin needs cleaning, and I am not much good at mending or cooking. If you are willing to work hard, I could offer you room and board plus a small wage." Eliza's first instinct was to refuse. Going off alone with a strange man to his isolated cabin in the mountains was exactly the sort of thing her mother would have warned her against. But what choice did she have? She had 3 days before Mrs. Henderson put her out on the street, and she had found no other prospects in town. So at least this way she would have a roof over her head and food in her belly, and something in Colton Bennett's steady gaze made her think that he was not the sort of man who would take advantage of a woman in desperate circumstances. "When would you want me to start?" she asked. "I'm heading back up the mountain tomorrow morning at first light," Colton said. "If you want the position, be at the livery stable at dawn. I will have a horse ready for you." Eliza nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. "I will be there, Mr. Bennett. Thank you." That night, Eliza lay in her narrow bed at the boarding house and tried not to think about what she was about to do. She was going to go off into the wilderness with a man she had just met, a man who looked like he could break her in half with his bare hands if he so chose. But she thought about the way he had stood up to those 3 thugs without hesitation, the careful gentleness in his grip when he shook her hand, and the straightforward honesty in his eyes when he made his offer. She had to trust her instincts, and her instincts told her that Colton Bennett, for all his intimidating size and rough appearance, was a good man. For the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, Eliza did not cry herself to sleep. She rose before dawn the next morning and packed her few belongings into the carpet bag she had brought from St. Louis. Mrs. Henderson was surprised when Eliza informed her that she would be leaving that very day, but she quickly counted out the refund for the unused portion of Eliza's rent and wished her well with obvious relief. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky with streaks of pink and gold when Eliza arrived at the livery stable, her carpet bag clutched in one hand and her heart hammering in her chest. Colton was already there, loading supplies onto a massive draft horse that looked strong enough to pull a wagon by itself. When he saw Eliza, he gave her a brief nod and gestured to a smaller mare that was saddled and waiting. "Can you ride?" he asked. "A little," Eliza admitted. "It has been some years." "She's gentle," Colton assured her, taking her bag and securing it to his own horse. "Just hold on to the saddle horn and let her follow my horse. She knows the way." Eliza managed to mount the mare with only a little awkwardness, grateful that her morning dress, while plain, was practical enough for riding. Colton swung up onto his draft horse with easy grace despite his size, and then they were heading out of town, following a narrow trail that led up into the pine-covered mountains. The ride took nearly 3 hours, and by the time Colton finally reined in his horse, Eliza's legs were aching and her back was stiff from the unaccustomed exercise. But when she looked around at their surroundings, she could not help but catch her breath at the wild beauty of the place. They were in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and aspens, with a clear stream running along one edge. The cabin itself was larger than Eliza had expected, built from thick logs and chinked with mud and moss. It had a solid, permanent look to it, as though it had been there for decades, and smoke rose from the stone chimney that dominated one wall. Behind the cabin, the mountains rose in jagged peaks, their slopes covered with forest, and their summits still dusted with snow despite the warmth of the August day. "This is beautiful," Eliza breathed, momentarily forgetting her nervousness. Colton dismounted and came to help her down from the mare, his large hands steadying her as she slid to the ground. "It is home," he said simply, releasing her as soon as she had found her footing. "Come on, I will show you around." The inside of the cabin was dim and cool after the bright sunshine outside. It consisted of one large main room with a massive stone fireplace, a smaller bedroom partitioned off in the back, and a loft that could be reached by a sturdy ladder. The furniture was rough but well made, clearly crafted by someone who knew what they were doing. There was a table and chairs, a comfortable-looking armchair near the fireplace, shelves lined with books and supplies, and a large bed in the partitioned room that Eliza quickly looked away from, feeling her cheeks heat. "You will sleep in the bedroom," Colton said, following her gaze. "I will take the loft. The privy is out back and there is a shed for the horses. The stream has good water for drinking and washing." "Where will I do the cooking?" Eliza asked, looking around for a stove. Colton pointed to an iron hook suspended over the fireplace. "There, I have pots and a Dutch oven. It's not fancy, but it works." Eliza nodded, taking mental inventory of what she would need to do. The cabin was not filthy exactly, but it had the neglected look of a place inhabited by a man who had more important things to worry about than dusting and sweeping. Beaked cobwebs festooned the corners, the floor needed scrubbing, and she suspected that the bedding had not been washed in far too long. "I will start by getting this place cleaned up," she said, rolling up her sleeves with more confidence than she felt. "Do you have soap and a scrub brush?" Over the next several days, Eliza threw herself into the work with a determination born of desperation. She scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, washed all the bedding and hung it in the sun to dry, cleared away the cobwebs, and organized the chaotic jumble of supplies on the shelves. She learned to cook over the open fire, producing simple but hearty meals of beans, bacon, and cornbread. She mended Colton's worn clothing and darned his socks. And she tried very hard not to think about the fact that she was living alone in the wilderness, with a man who was still very much a stranger to her. Colton, for his part, was the perfect gentleman. He rose before dawn each morning and disappeared into the forest, returning at dusk with game or firewood or whatever else needed doing. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were thoughtful and measured. He never came near her bedroom, never looked at her with anything but respectful courtesy, and never gave her any reason to fear him. In fact, Eliza found herself feeling safer in his presence than she had felt in a long time, as though his sheer physical strength created a protective barrier between her and the harsh realities of the world. But at night, alone in the darkness of the bedroom, with nothing but her thoughts for company, the grief would return with a vengeance. Eliza would press her face into the pillow and weep as silently as she could, her body shaking with sobs that she tried desperately to muffle. She did not want Colton to hear her, did not want him to think that she was weak or that he had made a mistake in bringing her to his home. But the loss of William was still so raw, so agonizing, that she could not seem to stop the tears from coming. On the fourth night, as Eliza lay crying into her pillow, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching the bedroom door. She froze, holding her breath, praying that Colton would think she was asleep and go away. But instead, there was a soft knock, and his deep voice came through the door, gentle and concerned. "Mrs. Hartford, Eliza, are you all right?" Eliza tried to answer, tried to say that she was fine. But the words would not come. Instead, a fresh wave of sobs broke over her, and she curled into a ball on the bed, shaking with the force of her grief. She heard the door open, and then Colton was there, his massive form filling the doorway. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, Eliza could see the concern etched on his face. "I'm sorry," she managed to gasp between sobs. "I'm so sorry. I'm trying to be quiet, but I cannot seem to stop." Colton was silent for a long moment, and then he crossed the room and lowered himself to sit on the edge of the bed. The mattress sagged under his weight, and Eliza found herself rolling slightly toward him. "How long has it been?" he asked quietly. 3 months, Eliza whispered. 3 months since William died. 3 months, and it still feels like yesterday. I thought I could be strong. I thought I could move on, but every night when I am alone with my thoughts, it all comes crashing back, and I feel like I am drowning." "Grief does not follow a schedule," Colton said, his voice rough but kind. "It takes as long as it takes. There is no shame in mourning the loss of someone you loved." "But I am disturbing you," Eliza said, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Just like I disturbed everyone at the boarding house, I cannot seem to control it." Colton reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and placed one large hand on her shoulder. The warmth and weight of it was oddly comforting, like an anchor holding her steady in a storm. "You are not disturbing me," he said firmly. "You are grieving. There is a difference." He paused and then added, "My wife died 4 years ago. Childbirth. The baby did not survive either. For a long time after that, I could not stop thinking about everything I should have done differently, everything I could have done to save them. The grief was like a beast living inside me, tearing me apart from the inside out." Eliza looked up at him, seeing the pain in his eyes even in the dim light. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I had no idea." "How could you?" Colton said with a slight shrug. "It was a long time ago. I'm not saying the grief ever goes away completely, but it does get easier to bear. Eventually, you learn to carry it without letting it crush you." They sat in silence for a moment, and then Colton said, "Would it help if I stayed, just until you fall asleep? Sometimes it is easier when you are not alone." Eliza knew she should refuse. It was improper for a man to be in her bedroom, even if he was sitting fully clothed on top of the covers. But the truth was, she did not want to be alone. The grief was too heavy, too overwhelming, and the thought of having someone there, someone who understood what it was like to lose everything, was more tempting than she could resist. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, please stay." Colton nodded and shifted to lean against the headboard, his long legs stretched out in front of him. Without thinking about it, Eliza found herself moving closer to him, drawn by the warmth and solidity of his presence. He hesitated for just a moment, and then he wrapped one massive arm around her shoulders, drawing her against his side. Eliza stiffened at first, unaccustomed to being so close to anyone after months of isolation and grief. But gradually, for she allowed herself to relax, resting her head against Colton's broad chest. She could hear the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, strong and reassuring, and feel the rise and fall of his breathing. The sobs began to subside, replaced by a deep exhaustion that pulled at her like a tide. "Tell me about him," Colton said quietly. "Tell me about William." And so Eliza did. She told him about how she and William had met at a church social, how he had been so earnest and kind, how he had courted her with flowers and poetry. She told him about their wedding, about the small apartment they had rented, about their dreams of starting a family and building a life together. She told him about the day she had received word of the accident at the factory, about how she had run through the streets in her apron and house slippers, praying that it was all a terrible mistake. She told him about the funeral, about the creditors who had circled like vultures, about the desperate loneliness that had driven her to flee west in search of a new beginning. Colton listened without interrupting, his arm a steady weight around her shoulders. When she finally fell silent, her voice hoarse from talking and crying, he said, "He sounds like he was a good man. You were lucky to have each other, even if it was only for a short time." "I know," Eliza whispered, "and I know I should be grateful for the time we had. But it hurts so much, Colton. Sometimes I think the pain is going to kill me." "It will not," Colton said with quiet certainty. "You are stronger than you know, Eliza Hartford. You had the courage to leave everything behind and start over in a place where you knew no one. You stood up to 3 armed men to protect a boy you did not even know. That takes a kind of strength that most people do not have. Eliza felt fresh tears prick at her eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for not judging me. Thank you for listening." "Anytime," Colton said simply, and Eliza could hear the truth in his words. She did not remember falling asleep, but when she woke the next morning, sunlight was streaming through the window, and she was alone in the bed. For a moment she wondered if she had dreamed the entire thing, but then she saw the indentation in the pillow next to hers and knew that it had been real. Colton had stayed with her until she fell asleep, holding her and listening to her pour out her grief, offering comfort without expecting anything in return. When she emerged from the bedroom, Colton was already up and working, as though nothing unusual had happened. He greeted her with a brief nod and a simple good morning, and Eliza followed his lead, acting as though it was perfectly normal for him to have spent the night sitting in her room while she cried herself to sleep in his arms. But something had shifted between them. The walls of polite formality that had existed before were beginning to crumble, replaced by a tentative understanding and the beginnings of genuine friendship. Over the following weeks, they fell into an easy rhythm of domestic life. Eliza kept the cabin clean and prepared their meals. And Colton hunted and fished and tended to the endless chores required to maintain a homestead in the wilderness. They talked more, sharing stories of their pasts and their hopes for the future. And Eliza found herself laughing for the first time in months at Colton's dry humor and wry observations about life. And at night, when the grief threatened to overwhelm her, Colton would come to her room without being asked. He would sit on the edge of the bed and hold her while she cried, his strong arms a barrier against the darkness, his steady heartbeat a reminder that she was not alone. Sometimes they would talk, and sometimes they would simply sit in silence, but always Eliza felt the burden of her grief becoming a little lighter, a little easier to bear. As the weeks turned into months and summer gave way to autumn, Eliza began to notice other changes as well. She found herself looking forward to Colton's return at the end of each day, her heart lifting at the sound of his footsteps on the porch. She caught herself studying the way his muscles flexed beneath his shirt as he chopped wood, the way his hair gleamed in the sunlight, the rare smile that transformed his rugged features into something almost boyish. She noticed the care he took with her, the way he always made sure she had enough firewood, the way he brought her wildflowers from the meadow, the way he listened to her with his full attention as though nothing else in the world mattered. And she realized, with a mixture of guilt and wonder, that she was beginning to care for him. Not in the same way she had loved William, who had been gentle and scholarly and utterly unsuited for this harsh frontier life. Colton was different, as solid and enduring as the mountains themselves, a man who knew how to survive and thrive in this unforgiving wilderness. He made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since before William's death, and more than that, he made her feel seen and valued and understood. But Eliza was not sure if Colton felt the same way. He was always kind and gentle with her, but he maintained a careful distance during the daylight hours, never touching her except when she was crying and in need of comfort. He treated her with respect and courtesy, but there was a wall around him, a guardedness that suggested he had been hurt too deeply to risk opening his heart again. It was late October when everything changed. And Colton had been gone since early morning, tracking an elk that he hoped would provide enough meat to see them through the coming winter. Eliza had spent the day preserving the last of the garden vegetables and mending a tear in one of Colton's shirts, humming softly to herself as she worked. She had not cried in over a week, and while she still missed William and always would, the raw, agonizing pain had begun to fade into a bittersweet ache that she could live with. Dusk was falling when she heard the sound of shouting coming from the direction of town. Eliza set down her mending and went to the door, peering out into the gathering darkness. A moment later, she saw a figure stumbling up the path toward the cabin, and her heart lurched when she recognized the boy from the alley, the one she and Colton had saved from Tucker and his friends. "Help!" the boy gasped, collapsing onto the porch. His face was bruised and swollen, and blood dripped from a gash on his forehead. "Please, you have to help. They are coming. Tucker and his men. They are coming for Mr. Bennett." Eliza's blood ran cold. What are you talking about? Why are they coming here? The boy coughed, wincing in pain. Tucker has been saying for weeks that Mr. Bennett humiliated him in front of the whole town. He's been drinking all day, working himself up. He and 6 other men rode out about an hour ago. They mean to kill him, ma'am. They have guns and they are mean drunk. Eliza felt panic rise in her throat. Colton was out there somewhere in the forest, unarmed except for his hunting rifle, with no idea that danger was heading his way. She had to warn him, but how? She had no idea where he had gone, and even if she did, 7 armed men would be more than even Colton could handle. Come inside, she told the boy, helping him to his feet. We need to get you cleaned up. She had just finished bandaging the worst of the boy's injuries when she heard the sound of horses approaching. Her heart hammered in her chest as she peered out the window and saw 7 riders emerge from the tree line, Tucker at their head. They were all heavily armed and swaying in their saddles, clearly drunk and spoiling for a fight. Bennett, Tucker bellowed, his voice echoing through the clearing. Come out here, you coward. Time to settle accounts. Eliza's mind raced. She had to buy time, had to find some way to warn Colton before he walked into a trap. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, forcing herself to stand tall and calm even though her knees were shaking. Mr. Bennett is not here, she called out, her voice carrying across the clearing. He is out hunting and will not be back until tomorrow. You men should go back to town and sleep off whatever liquor you have been drinking. Tucker urged his horse forward, his scarred face twisted into an ugly sneer. Well, if it ain't the little lady from the alley, I remember you. Always sticking your nose where it does not belong. He looked around at his companions and grinned. Maybe we should teach her some manners while we wait for Bennett to come home. The other men laughed, a sound that made Eliza's skin crawl. She was about to retreat back into the cabin when she heard a voice from the edge of the clearing, calm and cold as winter ice. You want to settle accounts, Tucker? Then settle them with me. Leave the woman out of it. Colton emerged from the shadows at the edge of the forest, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He must have heard the commotion and circled around, Eliza realized. He looked utterly fearless, standing there facing down 7 armed men, his broad shoulders squared and his eyes blazing with barely controlled fury. Tucker wheeled his horse around, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip. There you are, Bennett. Been waiting to do this for a long time. 7 against 1, Colton observed, his voice dripping with contempt. Those are the kind of odds cowards need to feel brave. Coward, Tucker spat. You are the one hiding up here in the mountains like a hermit, too good to drink with the rest of us. Too good to come to town, except when you need supplies. Think you are better than everyone else. I think I am better than men who beat up boys and threaten women, Colton said flatly. Now you have 2 choices. You can ride out of here right now, and we will forget this ever happened. Or you can make this ugly, and I promise you, Tucker, if you choose that path, you will not like how it ends. For a moment, Eliza thought Tucker might actually back down. But then one of the other men, emboldened by drink and the presence of his companions, raised his rifle and fired. The shot went wide, but it shattered the tense standoff. Colton moved with shocking speed for a man his size, diving behind a woodpile as more shots rang out. Eliza screamed and ducked back into the cabin, pulling the boy down to the floor with her. Stay down, she hissed, crawling toward the window so she could see what was happening. Outside, chaos had erupted. The horses, spooked by the gunfire, were rearing and bucking, throwing off several of the riders. Colton had returned fire, and one of Tucker's men clutched his shoulder and slumped in his saddle. Another shot, and a second man toppled from his horse with a cry of pain. The remaining men scattered, taking cover behind trees and rocks as they continued to fire at Colton's position. Eliza's heart was in her throat as she watched Colton reload his rifle with calm efficiency, his movements steady and practiced despite the bullets whining past his head. He was outnumbered and outgunned, and Eliza knew that it was only a matter of time before one of those shots found its mark. She had to do something. Looking around desperately, her eyes fell on the old shotgun that Colton kept mounted above the fireplace. She had never fired a gun in her life, but she could not just sit here and watch him die. Moving quickly, she climbed onto a chair and pulled down the shotgun, checking to make sure it was loaded. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold it, but she forced herself to move to the window. Taking a deep breath, Eliza aimed at the tree where one of Tucker's men was hiding and squeezed the trigger. The recoil knocked her backward, and the shot went wild, but it had the desired effect. The men, realizing that they were now taking fire from two directions, began to hesitate. Another shot from Colton dropped a third man, and that was enough. The remaining riders scrambled for their horses and fled into the darkness, leaving their wounded companions behind. Tucker, his face twisted with rage and humiliation, fired one last shot at Colton before wheeling his horse around and galloping away, shouting threats over his shoulder. And then there was silence, broken only by the moans of the wounded men lying in the clearing. Eliza dropped the shotgun and rushed outside, her legs barely supporting her as she ran to where Colton was emerging from behind the woodpile. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, her hands running over his arms and chest, searching for injuries. "Did they hit you?" "I am fine," Colton assured her, catching her hands in his and holding them still. "I am not hurt, Eliza. I am fine." Relief flooded through her, so intense that her knees buckled. Colton caught her, his strong arms wrapping around her and pulling her against his chest. Eliza clung to him, shaking with reaction, her face pressed against his shirt. "I thought they were going to kill you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I was going to lose you, and I could not bear it, Colton. I could not bear it." She felt Colton go very still, and then his arms tightened around her. "Eliza," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "are you saying what I think you are saying?" Eliza pulled back just enough to look up into his face, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "I'm saying that I care about you, Colton Bennett. I'm saying that these past months living here with you have been the happiest I have known since William died. I'm saying that when I thought those men might hurt you, I realized that I could not imagine my life without you in it." Colton's expression was a mixture of wonder and disbelief. "But William," he began, "you loved him. You are still in mourning." "I will always love William," Eliza said, tears streaming down her face. "He was my husband, and I will carry him in my heart for the rest of my life. But William is gone, and I am still here. And I do not want to spend the rest of my life alone, grieving for what I lost. I want to live, Colton. I want to be happy again. And you make me happy. You make me feel safe and valued and cared for. Is that so wrong?" "It is not wrong," Colton said, his voice thick with emotion. He reached up and cupped her face in his large, calloused hands, his thumb gently wiping away her tears. "God help me, Eliza. I have been falling in love with you since the day I saw you standing up to those men in the alley. I told myself it was impossible, that you were still mourning your husband, that I had no right to feel the way I did. But every day it got harder to deny. Every night when I held you while you cried, I wished I had the right to hold you always. I love you, Eliza Hartford. I love your courage and your kindness and your strength. And if you will have me, I swear I will spend the rest of my life making you happy." "Yes," Eliza breathed, her heart soaring. "Yes, Colton, yes to all of it." And then he was kissing her, his lips gentle and reverent as though she were something precious and fragile. Eliza kissed him back, her arms wrapping around his neck, her fingers tangling in his long hair. And it was nothing like the chaste kisses she had shared with William. This kiss was fierce and passionate and full of promise, a declaration of everything they had been too afraid to say out loud. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Colton rested his forehead against hers and smiled, a real smile that lit up his entire face. "Marry me, Eliza, not tomorrow, not even next month, when you are ready. But say you will be my wife, and I will be the happiest man alive." "I will marry you," Eliza promised, laughing through her tears. "As soon as we can find a preacher, I will marry you, Colton Bennett." They might have stood there forever, wrapped in each other's arms, but a groan from one of the wounded men reminded them that they had more immediate concerns. Reluctantly, Eliza pulled away and went to tend to the injured men, she and her nursing instincts overriding her distaste for men who had come to do murder. Colton tied them up and then rode into town to fetch the sheriff, returning near dawn with a grim-faced lawman who took the prisoners into custody and promised that Tucker and his remaining men would be hunted down and brought to justice. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Word of the shootout spread quickly through Silver Creek, and the townspeople, many of whom had suffered at Tucker's hands but been too afraid to speak up, rallied around Colton and Eliza. Tucker and his men were captured trying to flee across the border into Wyoming, and they were brought back to stand trial. The boy Eliza had tried to protect, whose name turned out to be Tommy, recovered from his injuries and became a frequent visitor to the cabin, he clearly having adopted Colton and Eliza as surrogate family. 3 weeks after the shootout, on a crisp November morning with the first snow beginning to dust the mountain peaks, Eliza Hartford became Eliza Bennett in a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher in Silver Creek's small church. She wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had sewn herself, and Colton wore his best shirt and a new pair of trousers, his long hair neatly combed and his beard trimmed. There were no flowers, no fancy decorations, but the church was full of well-wishers. And when Colton slipped a simple gold band onto Eliza's finger and kissed her for the first time as her husband, she felt her heart overflow with joy. That night, as they lay together in the bed that was now theirs to share, Eliza marveled at how much her life had changed in just a few short months. She had come to Montana Territory a broken woman, hollowed out by grief and loss, with no hope and no future. And now she lay in the arms of a man who loved her with a fierce and protective devotion in a home that felt more real and solid than anything she had known back in St. Louis. "Are you happy?" Colton asked, his deep voice rumbling through his chest where her head rested. "Happier than I ever thought I would be again," Eliza answered truthfully. She tilted her head back to look up at him, studying the strong lines of his face in the firelight. "Colton, can I ask you something?" "Anything," he said, his hand stroking gently through her hair. "Do you think it is wrong that I love you? That I could move on from William so quickly?" Colton was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I do not think it is wrong at all," he finally said. "You loved William, and you will always carry that love with you. But love is not a finite resource, Eliza. Loving me does not diminish what you felt for him. It just means that your heart is big enough to love again, to find happiness again, even after loss. And William, if he loved you the way you say he did, would want that for you. He would want you to be happy, not to spend the rest of your life alone and grieving." Tears pricked at Eliza's eyes, but this time they were tears of healing rather than sorrow. "I think you are right," she whispered. "Thank you for understanding. Thank you for being patient with me." "Always," Colton promised, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I will always be patient with you, Eliza. I will always be here to hold you when the grief returns, and I will be here to celebrate with you when joy comes. That is what marriage means, being there for each other, no matter what comes." Winter came early and fierce that year, blanketing the mountains in deep snow and turning the world into a frozen wilderness. But inside the cabin, Eliza and Colton were warm and content, learning the rhythms of married life. Eliza discovered that Colton had a wry sense of humor and a surprisingly gentle touch, that he loved to read by the fire in the evenings, and that he sang old folk songs in a pleasant baritone when he thought no one was listening. Colton discovered that Eliza was tougher than she looked, that she could shoot nearly as well as he could once he taught her how, and that her laughter was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. There were still nights when the grief would return, when Eliza would wake from dreams of William with tears on her cheeks. But now she did not have to cry alone. Colton would gather her into his arms and hold her while she wept, offering comfort without judgment, understanding that healing was not a straight path, but a journey with many twists and turns. And gradually, as the weeks turned into months, those nights became less frequent, the tears less bitter, until Eliza realized that she had not cried herself to sleep in over a month. Spring came late to the mountains, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a riot of color and life. The snow melted into rushing streams, while wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and the forest came alive with birdsong. And with the spring came another change. Eliza began to notice subtle differences in her body, a tenderness in her breasts, a queasy feeling in the mornings, a missed monthly cycle. At first she was afraid to hope, afraid to believe that it could be true, but as the weeks passed and the signs became unmistakable, she could no longer deny it. She was pregnant. Eliza waited until she was certain before telling Colton, choosing a warm May evening as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset behind the mountains. Her heart was pounding as she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "Colton," she said softly, "we're going to have a baby." The expression on his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life. Pure, unfiltered joy mixed with wonder and a touch of fear, his pale blue eyes shining with tears. "A baby," he repeated, his voice breaking. "Eliza, are you certain?" "I am certain," she confirmed, her own eyes filling with happy tears. "We are going to be parents, Colton. Are you happy?" "Happy?" Colton pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Eliza, I am terrified and thrilled and more grateful than I know how to express. After I lost Sarah and our baby, I never thought I would have another chance. And now you are giving me that chance. You are giving me everything I never dared to hope for." They held each other as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, making plans and dreaming dreams about the child they would soon welcome into the world. Colton insisted on doing all the heavy work around the cabin, refusing to let Eliza lift anything heavier than a cooking pot. He fussed over her constantly, making sure she ate enough and rested enough, his protective instincts in full force. Eliza found it both endearing and exasperating, but she could not deny that she loved being cared for with such devotion. As her belly began to swell with their growing child, Eliza found herself thinking often about the journey that had brought her to this moment. If William had not died, she would never have come west. If she had not come west, she would never have met Colton. It seemed almost cruel to be grateful for the tragedy that had upended her life, but she could not help feeling that somehow everything had happened the way it was meant to. William had been her first love, and she would always cherish the time they had together. But Colton was her true partner, her match in every way that mattered, the man who had helped her find her way back from the darkness of grief into the light of hope and joy. In late November, as the first snows of winter began to fall once more, Eliza went into labor. Colton rode through the storm to fetch the midwife from town, a capable woman named Mrs. O'Brien, who had delivered half the babies in Silver Creek. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Colton, pacing anxiously in the main room of the cabin, was certain he was going to lose Eliza the way he had lost Sarah. But Eliza was strong, and she fought with every ounce of strength she possessed, determined to bring their child safely into the world. Just before dawn, as the storm finally began to clear, the thin, angry wail of a newborn filled the cabin. Colton burst into the bedroom to find Eliza exhausted but smiling, cradling a red-faced, squalling infant in her arms. "You have a son," Mrs. O'Brien announced with satisfaction. "A big, healthy boy with a fine set of lungs." Colton approached the bed as though walking on sacred ground, his eyes fixed on the tiny bundle in Eliza's arms. When he looked down at his son for the first time, at the small, perfect face and the tiny fists waving in the air, he felt something break open in his chest, a flood of love so intense it was almost painful. "Hello, little one," he whispered, reaching out to stroke one finger gently over the baby's soft cheek. "Welcome to the world." "What should we name him?" Eliza asked, but her voice hoarse from the long hours of labor, but her eyes bright with joy. Colton thought for a moment, and then he said, "What about William? In honor of the man who loved you first and who would be glad to know that you found happiness again." Fresh tears spilled down Eliza's cheeks, but they were tears of gratitude and love. "William Colton Bennett," she said, testing the name. "I think it is perfect." The baby, as if in agreement, stopped crying and opened his eyes, staring up at his parents with that unfocused newborn gaze that seemed to see straight into the soul. And in that moment, Eliza felt the last remnants of her old grief fall away, replaced by a sense of peace and contentment that filled her to overflowing. The years that followed were busy and full. Young William grew into a sturdy, incurious toddler who followed his father everywhere, his small legs churning to keep up with Colton's long strides. Eliza gave birth to twin girls when William was 2 years old, and the cabin rang with the sounds of children's laughter and the chaos of family life. Colton built an addition onto the cabin to accommodate their growing family, and he taught Eliza how to hunt and trap and survive in the wilderness, making her a true partner in all aspects of their life. Tommy, the boy they had saved, became like a son to them, eventually building his own cabin nearby and starting his own family. The community around Silver Creek grew and prospered, and Colton and Eliza became respected members, known for their kindness and generosity. There were hard times, too, winters when food was scarce and illnesses that struck without warning. But they faced everything together, drawing strength from each other and from the family they had built. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Colton gave Eliza a beautiful quilt that he had commissioned from the best seamstress in Silver Creek, made from pieces of fabric that represented different moments in their life together. There was a scrap of Eliza's blue wedding dress, a piece of the shirt Colton had been wearing the day they met, a bit of the baby blanket that had swaddled young William when he was born, and dozens of other precious memories stitched together into a work of art. "I wanted you to have something that showed how far we have come," Colton explained as Eliza ran her hands over the quilt with tears in her eyes. "From two broken people who found each other in the wilderness to this, to our family and our life together. Every piece of this quilt represents a moment that brought us here, to this place of love and peace and happiness." "It is beautiful," Eliza whispered, standing on her toes to kiss him, "just like our life together. Thank you, Colton. Thank you for saving me, for loving me, for giving me a reason to live again." "You saved me just as much as I saved you," Colton replied, wrapping his arms around her. "Maybe more. You taught me that it is possible to love again after loss, that the heart can heal even when you think it is broken beyond repair. You gave me a family and a future when I thought I had neither. I am the one who should be thanking you, Eliza Bennett." They stood together on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set behind the mountains that had become their home, was surrounded by the sounds of their children playing in the yard. The ghosts of their pasts would always be with them, William and Sarah and the baby who had never drawn breath. But those ghosts were no longer chains holding them back. They were gentle presences, reminders of where they had been and how far they had traveled, shadows that served to make the light of their present happiness shine all the brighter. Eliza never cried herself to sleep anymore. There were still moments of sadness, of missing what might have been, but they were tempered now with gratitude for what was. And on the rare nights when the old grief would stir, reaching out to pull her back into the darkness, she had only to turn to the man sleeping beside her, to feel the solid warmth of him and the steady beat of his heart, to remember that she was not alone, thus that she would never be alone again. The neighbors who had once groaned about her crying every night were long forgotten, scattered to the winds like dust. But the mountain man who had held her until the crying finally ended remained, constant and true, a rock she could build her life upon. And together they had created something beautiful out of their shared pain, a love story that would endure through all the years to come, a testament to the human capacity for healing and hope and the courage to begin again. As winter approached once more, and the children grew taller and the cabin filled with the warmth of family and love, Eliza would sometimes think back to that frightened, grief-stricken young woman who had arrived in Silver Creek all those years ago, so broken she thought she would never be whole again. And she would whisper a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever force had guided her steps to this wild and beautiful place, to this strong and gentle man, to this life that was so much richer and fuller than anything she had dared to imagine. She had lost everything once, but in losing everything, she had found something far more precious. She had found herself, she had found love, and she had found home. And that, Eliza knew, was worth every tear she had ever shed, every dark night she had survived, every moment of pain that had brought her to this place of peace. The mountain wind whistled through the pines, carrying with it the promise of snow and the whisper of seasons turning. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled merrily on the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The children were tucked safely in their beds, and their soft breathing a gentle counterpoint to the howl of the wind outside. And in the big bed that Colton had built with his own hands, Eliza lay in her husband's arms, safe and warm and loved, listening to his heartbeat and feeling the weight of his hand resting protectively over her slightly rounded belly where their fourth child grew. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness and felt him smile against her hair. "I love you too," Colton murmured back, his voice rough with sleep and contentment. Now and always, Eliza. Now and always. And as Eliza drifted off to sleep, surrounded by the love she had found in this wild and beautiful place, she knew that the crying had finally ended, not because the grief had disappeared, but because it had been transformed. Transformed by love and time and the healing power of finding someone who understood, someone who held on when the darkness threatened to consume her, someone who had shown her that even in the depths of despair, there was still hope, still a future, still a chance for happiness. The neighbors no longer groaned about the woman who cried every night, because that woman no longer existed. In her place was a strong, capable pioneer wife and mother, a woman who had faced her grief and emerged on the other side stronger and more resilient than before. The mountain man who had held her until the crying finally ended had become her husband, her partner, her love, and together they had built a life that was testament to the power of compassion, understanding, and the courage to open one's heart again after it has been shattered. As the years continued to pass, their family grew and flourished. Young William grew into a strong, thoughtful young man who inherited his father's size and strength and his mother's compassionate heart. The twin girls, Rose and Lily, were as different as night and day, one wild and adventurous, the other gentle and scholarly, but both adored by their parents and older brother. The fourth child, a boy they named Samuel, arrived healthy and robust, adding his voice to the joyful chaos of the Bennett household. Colton continued to hunt and trap, providing for his family with the same steady reliability that characterized everything he did. He taught his sons to track and shoot, to respect the wilderness and understand its rhythms. He taught his daughters to be strong and independent, to stand up for themselves and for others who could not stand up for themselves. And through it all, he remained Eliza's anchor, her safe harbor in any storm, the man who had proven to her that love could bloom even in the ashes of tragedy. Eliza, for her part, became known throughout the region as a skilled healer and midwife, using the knowledge she had gained from helping Mrs. O'Brien and from her own experiences to assist other women through childbirth and illness. She never forgot what it was like to be alone and frightened in a strange place, and she made it her mission to ensure that no woman in Silver Creek would ever feel that way if she could help it. Her home was always open to those in need, and more than one traveler or new arrival found themselves welcomed at the Bennett table, or fed and sheltered and sent on their way with supplies and good wishes. The cabin on the mountain became more than just a home. It became a symbol of hope and resilience, a place where love had triumphed over loss and where a family had been forged from the broken pieces of two shattered lives. People in town would speak of Colton and Eliza Bennett with respect and admiration, telling their story to newcomers as an example of the strength and courage that characterized the best of frontier life. On their 20th wedding anniversary, the Bennett family gathered for a celebration that brought together friends and neighbors from miles around. Tommy came with his wife and 5 children, the youngest a baby girl who looked up at Colton with wide, adoring eyes. Mrs. O'Brien, now retired but still sharp as a tack, regaled the younger women with stories of the night young William had been born, how Eliza had been so brave, and how Colton had worn a path in the floorboards with his anxious pacing. The townspeople brought food and music, and the clearing around the cabin echoed with laughter and song until the stars came out overhead. As the party began to wind down and the guests departed for their homes, Eliza and Colton found themselves alone on the porch once more, watching the last of the wagons disappear down the mountain trail. Their children were inside, cleaning up, their voices carrying through the open windows in a familiar symphony of bickering and laughter. 20 years, Eliza marveled, leaning against Colton's solid frame. It seems like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. 20 years, Colton agreed, wrapping his arm around her waist. At 52, he was still as strong as ever, though his dark hair was now liberally streaked with silver and his beard had gone completely white. The best 20 years of my life, Eliza. Every single day with you has been a gift. Even the hard days, Eliza teased, looking up at him with eyes that still sparkled with the same spirit that had first attracted him all those years ago. The days when the children were sick, or the winters were too harsh, or we thought we might not make it through. Especially those days, Colton said seriously. because those were the days when we had to rely on each other, when we had to be strong together. Those were the days that proved our love was real, that it could weather any storm. Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes, but they were happy tears. It's tears of gratitude and joy. "I never thought I could be this happy again," she confessed. "After William died, I thought my life was over. I thought I would spend the rest of my days as a ghost, going through the motions but never really living. And then you found me, Colton. You held me when I cried. You listened when I needed to talk. You gave me space to heal and time to grieve. You showed me that it was possible to love again, to build a new life out of the ruins of the old. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Colton corrected gently. "You think you were the only one who was saved? Eliza, I was dying up here on this mountain, slowly turning into a hermit who would rather avoid people than risk being hurt again. And then you came into my life, all fierce courage and hidden strength. And you reminded me what it meant to be human. You reminded me that life is meant to be lived, not just endured. We saved each other, love. That is what makes our story so special." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the moon rise over the mountains. Inside, the children had finished cleaning and were settling down for the night, their voices gradually quieting as sleep claimed them one by one. It was a peaceful scene, the kind of domestic tranquility that Eliza had once thought she would never experience again. "Do you think William would approve?" Eliza asked suddenly, voicing a question that had crossed her mind many times over the years. "Do you think he would be happy that I found love again, that I built a life with you?" Colton considered the question carefully, as he always did when Eliza spoke of her first husband. "I think," he said slowly, "that any man who truly loved you would want you to be happy. And I think William must have loved you very much, based on everything you have told me about him. So yes, Eliza, I think he would approve. I think he would be glad to know that you did not waste your life grieving for him, that you found joy and purpose and love again. And I think he would be grateful to know that his name lives on through our son, that he is not forgotten." "He is not forgotten," Eliza agreed softly. "He will never be forgotten, but he is no longer the center of my world, the way he once was. That place belongs to you now, Colton. You and our children and this life we have built together." "As it should be," Colton said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "The past is important, and we should honor it and learn from it. But we live in the present, and we build our future one day at a time. That is all anyone can do." As they finally turned to go inside, Eliza paused one last time to look out at the wilderness that had become her home. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnesses to all the joys and sorrows that played out in their shadows. The forest whispered its ancient secrets to the wind. And somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that was answered by others in the pack, reminding her that no one truly had to face the world alone. The crying had ended years ago, silenced not by force or by forgetting, but by healing. The neighbors who had once complained were long gone, their irritation forgotten in the face of the respect and affection that the community now held for the Bennett family. The mountain man who had held her through those dark nights had become so much more than a protector or a savior. He had become her partner, her equal, her love, and together they had proven that even the deepest grief could be overcome, that even the most broken heart could learn to love again. As Eliza climbed into bed that night, with Colton's arm draped over her waist and his steady breathing a familiar comfort in the darkness, she thought about everything that had led her to this moment. The pain and the loss, yes, but also the unexpected kindness, the courage to take a chance on a stranger, the slow, patient building of trust and affection that had blossomed into love. It had not been an easy journey, and there had been times when she thought she would not survive it. But she had, and in surviving, she had discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. The story of how Eliza Hartford became Eliza Bennett would be told and retold for generations in Silver Creek, becoming a part of the town's history and folklore. People would speak of the young widow who cried every night, whose grief was so profound that it disturbed the sleep of everyone around her. They would speak of the mountain man who came down from his isolated cabin and offered her not just employment, but hope. and they would speak of how love had found a way, even in the harshest of circumstances, even when it seemed impossible, even when the weight of past loss threatened to crush any chance of future happiness. But for Eliza and Colton, it was not a legend or a folk tale. It was simply their life, lived day by day with all the ordinary joys and challenges that come with building a family and making a home in the wilderness. There were still hard times ahead, still losses to grieve and obstacles to overcome. But they would face everything together, just as they had from the beginning, drawing strength from each other and from the unshakable foundation of love they had built. The crying had ended, but the love story was far from over. It would continue for all the years to come, through the raising of children and the welcoming of grandchildren, through seasons of plenty and seasons of want, through health and sickness, through joy and sorrow. It would continue until the day, many years in the future, when Colton would hold Eliza's hand one final time as she slipped peacefully away, surrounded by the family they had created together. And it would continue even beyond that, living on in the hearts and memories of their children and their children's children, a testament to the power of love to heal, to transform, and to endure. But that was still many years away. For now, in this moment, Eliza was content to lie in her husband's arms, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant howl of wolves, feeling the warmth of the fire and the solid presence of the man who had taught her how to live again. The neighbors no longer groaned about the woman who cried every night, because that woman had been transformed by love into someone new, someone stronger, someone who had learned that even in the darkest night, dawn always comes eventually. And the mountain man who had held her until the crying finally ended had become the love of her life, the father of her children, and the keeper of her heart, now and always, for as long as they both should live.